Hello and welcome to VoTY Frontline. At the VoTY Frontline, we'll be tracing the supporters that help to spread knowledge and discussion to the youth, and by doing so, help to empower the youth. As you know, VoTY is a space for the growth of the voice of the youth and allowing it to spread, and this new podcast brings connection between the networks. Over the past 4 weeks, we've traced the VoTY Frontline to a gaming channel, to podcast, and a band. And now we're bringing that to linguistics in this 4th episode of our journey. Today we were speaking to the Milu Project, which is on YouTube and is really popular at the moment. And the link will be in the description if you want to have a look after the podcast. On it, Joshua, who we have on today, does conlanging, as well as videos about linguistics and world building, which he helps to help the linguistics experiment that the Milu Project takes you on. So Joshua, if you wouldn't mind telling us what the Milu Project is and what it does.
Well, the Milu Project is a channel about linguistics and making languages. So basically, we look at languages around the world and interesting features which they have, and then apply those back into constructed languages.
Yeah, that sounds great. And in this, it doesn't seem to be a field that you learn at school, doesn't seem to be a field that's easily accessible to the youth. We'll move on to that in a minute, but I'm wondering what your aim or vision is at the Milu Project.
My vision is sort of to make language more accessible to everyone, and for people to have more understanding of the elements that make up language. Yeah,
that sounds great. And would you mind telling us a bit about the importance, because obviously the youth who this podcast is directed at will not have education. It's not something you learn at secondary school or primary school for that matter. And in MFL, modern foreign languages, it's not necessarily linguistically focused. So what is the importance of the linguistics?
Well, I think it's quite important because it gives you appreciation for one, the language that you speak and languages that other people speak. And it also helps your problem solving skills, and yeah.
And do you think it will help people to learn new languages as well if they learn the skills which then go forward to make up these languages?
Yeah, because every language is built out of the same features, and learning how they work will give you a greater understanding of other languages.
Yeah, and you mentioned the connection there. I'm interested to know a bit more about the connection between different languages, and maybe how that could encourage our listeners to actually make connections between the languages they're learning at school and the languages they're speaking on a day-to-day basis. How would they make those connections?
Well, there are quite a lot of connections to be made, in the grammar and some of the quite interesting elements of different languages. For example, some languages might have really long words, and other languages might have shorter words, and it's quite interesting to look at why that is. Yeah. and how it affects different languages.
Yeah. And you also use world building in your description. You say that helps conlanging as well. So how do you think knowing about the culture you want to create your language for will help to create your language for it?
Well, basically, the language people speak affects their culture and their perception of the world. So, understanding how a certain group of people views the world sort of gives you a better understanding of their language, and it helps you to be more aware of the more subtle things in languages. Yeah,
and you through speaking to me for the last few minutes, you've shown a lots of interest in linguistics. So tell me a bit about how you've developed the project.
Well, it sort of started as a world-building project, but every world needs like a language behind it. So I sort of developed a language for it, and then around that language, I developed a dialect continuum. But then I wanted to like make the languages better, so I thought that to make them better, I needed to study more of the world's languages to get better ideas.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it's really become a big thing where you've sharing all your knowledge about linguistics. Tell me about how you find this information for those who want to look into a bit more about linguistics.
Well, I find a lot of my information online by reading grammatical guides of certain languages, and sometimes like you sort of have to look through a lot of internet pages to find the information you're looking for, but it's there.
Yeah. And how do you suggest listeners who are really interested in linguistics maybe start to create conlangs for themselves?
Well, first you probably need to study like other languages apart from the Indo-European languages, because learning languages like German, French and Spanish is great, but there are other languages out there with features that you probably wouldn't have came across before, so I think it's quite important to broaden your horizons.
Yeah, that is interesting. How would listeners go about doing that? How have you gone about doing that? Are platforms such as Duolingo things you're thinking of, or is it more about reading the grammatical guides that you've discussed earlier?
Well, I think Duolingo and other language learning sites are useful to a certain extent, but I think you really need to, because not all of the languages are that well documented. There are around 7,000 languages, and Duolingo doesn't even have 100 of them. So I think you need to look at some of the less popular languages through like grammatical guides and books and information online to like draw in some of that information.
Yeah, and you've recently done a few videos about writing systems. How would those who want to explore linguistics further go about making their own writing systems? Because that seems quite a different field to the grammar that you might learn at school or even Duolingo and the sites that we've talked about.
Well, with writing systems, you sort of first you need a language to base it off.
Yeah.
And then you need to like decide how the script is going to be written. So depending on whether it's going to be like carved into rocks or painted, it can be displayed in a variety of ways. So you need to decide that, and then based off that, you need to create symbols that look similar but are distinguishable from one another. Yeah,
that's great advice for those wanting to actually create conlangs themselves. I'm also wondering perhaps whether you could tell us a bit more about what videos and content you can have, and which might inspire listeners to go and look at your channel, which also in itself has lots of information about linguistics.
So I have a whole series on how to make a conlang for beginners, and I also have I'm starting this tour across South America, basically exploring some of the languages there, and that's coming in the next weeks. So yeah, definitely look out for that. And I also have some videos on languages like Etruscan and Latin in the ancient world. So yeah, they're quite interesting.
Yeah, it certainly seems so. And you mentioned there about your tour of South America. Do you have any other ideas in mind for what listeners listening to this podcast and later viewers of your YouTube channel, what they'll can expect to see in the upcoming months and maybe a year?
Well, after I finish South America, I'm probably going to move on to Europe and explore the Romance languages and how a language can change from one town to another, and they'll still be intelligible, but when you go further they turn into completely different languages that aren't mutually intelligible.
Yeah, that sounds really great. And what you've shown here is that you're opening up a whole new field for the youth, or anyone really, to get stuck into, which they may not otherwise be exposed to. And that's really important, and that's something that the Milu Project really helps with. And thank you, Joshua, for coming on the podcast today. Thank you for the Milu Project for all you're doing, and thank you for listening today. See you next week. Goodbye.